I mean, we are living in an Instagram world where everybody's got ADHD, everybody's got anxiety. So if parents are not physically available because they're away at work, that doesn't necessarily mean that their emotional needs are not being looked after. It is what they do with their time together, when they get time together. It is important to let parents know that giving birth to children is a big job and your life is going to change. And it is not as easy as, oh, we'll just wing it. Children will internalize what the adults value. So that becomes their internal voice and value. I also went to a school which continues to be known for its academic excellence, and I mean, I can joke about it that actually none of those marks, despite being a so-called high achiever in my own right, none of those marks influenced or helped me when adversity struck or when life became hard, because that was life skills, yes, and life skills came from my parenting and home. When it comes to those marks, of course, there's nothing wrong with inculcating or fostering or nurturing academic excellence, but I think the problem is that the script of excellence is limited to academics, and there is no other talent which is ever just enjoying the same status, enjoying the same position in the minds of schools, adults, teachers. Screens have replaced pacifiers, except that screens are designed to induce addiction. It changes your neurowiring. I mentioned the book by Jonathan Haidt. It's called The Anxious Generation. It is changing the way brains are developing. It is extremely scary.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Before the Bell. We have Nanki Oberoi with us today. Nanki is someone whose work I deeply admire. She is a chartered clinical psychologist and she works with a lot of children, parents and schools to help them navigate the developmental and psychological needs of modern childhood. Okay, welcome Nanki. Thank you so much for taking the time to come. This is episode 3 of Before the Bell, and we are going to talk about something very interesting today. So we'll start with something which a lot of urban families are navigating, which is families have gotten a lot more busier. It's harder to actually manage time in a city with a lot of traffic and lots going on. But what ends up happening is we end up actually compromising on sometimes the needs of a child, and we end up forgetting what a child needs. So my first question to you actually is, what actually happens when the emotional needs of a child are not met? And that could be a double income family, or it could be in a family where there is a constant caregiver.
So I think the most important answer to that question is that yes, needs are both emotional and material, and a lot of times parents don't have the choice to not be double income. Sometimes they have the choice to be double income because we have varied ranges of classes in society. Child welfare is expensive, so they don't have, what I'm trying to say is they don't have a choice to not work. Having said that, I think the early years are especially important to understand in terms of emotional needs, but childhood carries on right up till 18 and 25. And children, when we talk about emotional needs, what we're really talking about is children need connection, children need time, children need parenting. Yes. So if parents are not physically available because they're away at work, that doesn't necessarily mean that their emotional needs are not being looked after. It is what they do with their time together, when they get time together. It can be as short as 20 minutes, and allowing the child to take the lead in terms of how that time is spent. Quality time is very, very important in nourishing the attachment with the child, the relationship with the child. And a major ingredient of, I think, that relationship and that interaction is how interested are you and how involved are you in the child's life in terms of outside of academics, outside of schoolwork, outside of what are they getting right in terms of discipline and what are they not getting right. Because invariably parents get so preoccupied with their parenting task of getting their child to do this and do that, that they lose track of the fact that sometimes they just need to be with the child, which is what actually the concept of play is. Of course, bringing in an important aspect to this is age, because the first 3 to 5 years are incredibly crucial to having the consistent, stable presence of an attachment figure, whichever parent that might be, because children need that. So the absence of that is likely going to be experienced by the child as a deficit, as a deficiency, emotionally.
And this is the age group of, say, about close to 5 years?
Yes. Because in those years, the children are so utterly dependent on the caregiver to make sense of this big bad world. And a lot of initially, it starts with the sensory input, and from the way you hug them to kiss them. So their exploration of the world is through you. You are their medium. You are their via media. So how would you do that if you're away? You understand? And of course, there is a dilemma today. As you said, mothers have to go back to work, fathers have to go back to work. I think there is no straight answer. There is no easy answer. And that's where comes in the village, that it takes a village to raise a child, where if you can afford it, you should get additional support. You should also take the support of extended family, parents, etc., because it is an overwhelming process.
And sometimes there is a lot of guilt for parents, right? Which is, I am not here and I have to travel for work. And so in such cases, have you seen any difference if the caregiver or the constant caregiver in that age group of 0 to 5 is someone who is not mom and dad?
I would say yes. I know that that's not what everyone wants to hear. And I think I learned that because of the infant observation. That was part of my coursework at the Anna Freud Center, where a big part of the clinical work that we do is we observe a baby right from birth unto 1 year, through the duration of that course, and we basically observe the baby and mom interacting once a week, for the same time, same day, every week. And you really begin to see theory come to life. And how I often describe it is I see biology become psychology. In the beginning, you are just that ball of biology with hunger and thirst and cries, which none of it is integrated, none of it makes sense. And how that ball of biology needs the developed adult, the caregiver, to intuit for him or her that, okay, this cry means hunger, and this cry means I've pooped, and this cry means I want to play, and I want to just explore your face. And there is nobody better suited than the mother, or I would say the father. I mean, okay, we scratch that.
Yeah.
There is nobody better suited than an adult caregiver who's one of the parents. Having said that, we are in a world where parenting is taking many different shades. There's adoption, there's IVF, there's surrogacy. So there are various ways to think about pregnancy and childbirth today. I think time will tell how that impacts the quality of attachment henceforth, once birth happens. I am willing to say I do not fully understand it yet, because it's only as those children will grow up, because it's a recent phenomenon. But it is important to let parents know that giving birth to children is a big job, and your life is going to change. And it is not as easy as, we'll just wing it. And we'll give birth and then we'll go back to work and we'll be able to have a Saturday night out, and it just doesn't work like that, because that child is they're so utterly dependent on you to make sense of anything, and everything, especially in those first 3 years when they don't have a mind yet. So they are going to be dependent on you for you to make their mind for them.
And if you were to take like the other view, which is if for some reason, these needs are not met, and there is probably not a primary full-time caregiver.
So
how does it emanate in a toddler and say a tween?
So the reason why the first 3 years specifically are so important is that is the time where the blueprint of your attachment system, which is pretty much how you relate, in your interpersonal dynamics and how you relate with the world, is getting formed. So any disturbances and disruptions in that is going to then cause disturbances which prolong into later life. If you look at research from mental health, both child and adolescent and adult mental health, a lot of early disturbances are then correlated to later mental health problems, and can be predictive. Actually, predictive would be the right word. So that those first 3 years, because the attachment system is being formed.
It's like your foundation.
Yes, it is the foundation, and any disturbance to a foundation is going to then, be shaky for the child.
Yeah, yeah. And then what happens, say, if I were to say in age group which is above 5, which is, when needs are not met, like how does it probably emanate in, say, day-to-day behavior?
So I think there is a lot of, or the right way to put it would be that there is limited mental health literacy around children and adolescents, where often the concept of mental health is not associated with children. I often find, even in, when I supervise counselors, I'm constantly trying to explain this framework that child development is child mental health, right? So while a lot of development happens in those first 3 to 5 years, where they have used the relationship with both mom and dad to develop, and the developing body is also corresponding to developing changes in the mind, certain milestones. They then begin to use that blueprint to explore the world outside, peers and teachers and school and play and sports and themselves, their relationship with themselves. So schools, parents, society in general do not make that association.
Right.
They do not understand that actually child development, if they begin to understand child development outside of walking and talking and academics, ABCD,
excellence, yeah.
there is a lot to understand in terms of the relational dynamics of children and how they are responding to changes, how they're responding to transitions, how they're responding to the birth of a child, how family changes are being experienced by the child, is all shaping their personality. And all of it is actually material for us to really understand how do they manage distress, how are they shaping up, how are their minds shaping up. Because children don't experience anxiety and depression the way you and I as adults do, where we have a symptomatic presentation. The way they experience worries, the way they experience anxiety, the way they experience depression is sudden changes in their physical milestones in terms of food, they'll suddenly reject food which was earlier.
In fact, something as, I shouldn't say as small, but I was speaking to a few teachers a week ago, and they mentioned of how a lot of kids end up feeling anxiety when there is probably a change of class, or as in the environment, the classroom that they're sitting in, or there is a new concept which is a little harder, which has been introduced in class that day. And then some of these kids end up needing either occupational therapists, OTs is what they're called, to help them just regulate themselves into a new environment. And I guess this is what happens, right? And that anxiety probably, like as you were talking about, shows up in this way.
Yes. I mean, anxiety can show up in any way. It can show up in the way they're acting it out. It can, hitting. The point I was trying to make exactly was this, that what begins to get noticed as behavioral problems it's not understood. It often gets dealt with as this is a discipline problem, he's a problem child, but actually there's a lot going on emotionally for that child. Most of the times. And that needs to be understood. But I don't think there is enough literacy and understanding around
to be able to. And then in this environment, what do you see as the role of a school?
I mean, I think it's everything. But having said that, I am also beginning to really, as a systemic practitioner, or as someone who views child development from a systemic lens, I look at it as, there's family, there's school, and of course now there's technology, which is massively impacting the way children develop and their brains and their minds, overlapping with their, of course, physical development as well, because obviously they're spending so much time on iPads and they're not going out to play, also has mental health repercussions. Children spend almost 8 to 9 hours in school.
Every day for about 14 years of their life.
So as far as I'm concerned, school becomes, other than family, school becomes the place where they form a blueprint of the world. You understand? Where they get to rehearse relationships, where they get to rehearse conflicts, where they get to rehearse successes and failures. And if we are unable to respond to that appropriately as a school, for example, if we have strict and rigid scripts around the ethos of the school where a child has to be a particular way in order to be seen, in order to be heard, then we're failing the child. Whereas I think there's a huge change in the way schools are approaching education today, and thank God for that, where there are people who are investing in teachers who are far more compassionate, far more kind.
And there's space also for different types of learners.
Yes, counselors, special educators,
There's an
OT,
infrastructure.
yes. So just the fact that they're creating an infrastructure is in itself telling, implicitly telling of the fact that we're here for all kinds of you. You know, so that's, I think that's very meaningful for children where, I mean, if a child today in class 6 or 7 is feeling confident enough to walk into a counselor's room and saying, I want to talk about my feelings, I know I never did that. You know, I didn't even know that there was something known as that. So I think that is amazing. But I do think that the missing link is what is the vision of the school, you know, and how does the child feature in that? Because it's big talk, but as soon as we hit middle school and senior school, as a culture, and that's where the larger Indian society comes in. I don't know, I've never grown up in America, so I don't know what it's like over there, but academics takes center stage. So I think that is my only concern with schools. Otherwise, schools are doing a lot. I wish I worked in a school. I sometimes say that, you know.
But you know, what happens is, school, if you were to think of it as a product or an app, for example, there are a lot of features now which have been added onto it, right? There is a counselor available, and then there is X, and then there is Y. So there is, as a support system, if you were to try to tag it, there are a lot of features. But the core product in itself has stayed the same, which is there is only one core offering that you have to excel at academics. And there is a label. A, B, C, D, whatever, or rank 1, 2, 3, wherever that label is. But there are features around it, but it hasn't changed the culture of the school.
The core identity of education remains the same. And that's exactly the conversation we were having earlier, that in the school vocabulary, excellence is the only
way
adjective.
Of validation, identity.
And there is no room for anything less than excellence. And I'm not trying to say that, I mean, as someone who went to a school which was only, you know, rewarding academics, and then ended up pursuing that in a very huge way. I didn't end up pursuing anything. I was an adult by the time I realized actually I really like the outdoors and sports, and so there was a huge delay there. I think while schools are fostering a lot of that again, like in primary school, but then you come into grade 6 and parents and school board, now you have to get serious, you know, now you have to get serious. Which is not entirely wrong. I'm not saying that there is a solution to it, but I think the stakeholders as adults need to get together as a system to cause a change in the system, you know. An interesting conversation that I was having with the two moms that I have my podcast with is that it's so interesting that 10 years from now, children are not going to be aspiring to pursue jobs which even exist today. And the very next day, I heard a child tell me that, actually, I want to become a stand-up comedian. And I thought it was so interesting. I said, wow, I didn't have the balls to ever say something like that.
And dream something which is so off.
Yes. You know,
left of field in a way.
But the minute the child says that in a semi-traditional school or not traditional school also, it is even, I mean, you kind of shrug it off. You understand? You shrug it off as a, he's just saying that, but he will have to do an MBA or he will have to do some kind of a degree to figure it out.
In a way, you know, when you get into that zone of a traditional school, for example, and that happened to me. So I changed about 7 schools when I was growing up because of my father's job. And I quickly realized for myself that if I have to get comfortable in a new setup, so I was always the petite, shortest kid in class, you know, and so when you're the new kid and that there are many things to then
Yes,
bully and
yes,
get picked
yes,
on.
yes.
But I quickly realized that if I can be the teacher's pet and if I can be good at studies and be on the first bench, put my head down and ask the right questions, then I will probably be able to settle in more quickly. But in that journey, for example, what happened is even if I changed 7, 8 schools across boards and across countries and across cities, there was only one language of being accepted, which was
Marks.
marks. You know, and so I ended up studying engineering, but I honestly wish I did not. In fact, interestingly, in all of these schools that I was at, I should have, by that definition, been easily bullied in a way. But because I did well in school, and maybe these kids also found that valuable in a way that she's also the smart kid, I actually didn't end up getting bullied as much, even though I changed so many schools and I was the shortest kid on the first bench, first person in the assembly line. But there were many other girls who were standing behind me who would get bullied a lot, even though they were taller than me.
I think because that's the culture of a school, right? Because children will internalize what the adults value.
Yeah.
So that becomes their internal voice and value. And I also went to that really resonates with me because I also went to a school where which continues to be known for its academic excellence. And I mean, I can joke about it that actually none of those marks, despite being a so-called high achiever in my own right, none of those marks influenced or helped me when adversity struck or when life became hard, because that was life skills, yes, and life skills came from my parenting and home. But when it comes to those marks, of course, there's nothing wrong with inculcating or fostering or nurturing academic excellence. But I think the problem is that the script of excellence is limited to academics. And there is no other talent which is ever just enjoying the same status, enjoying the same position in the minds of schools, adults, teachers. I mean, something as simple as, it did happen actually, a change happened in my school where we used to have this scholar badge system, you know, where if you got...
We used to have a different section.
Yeah, I mean, yes, super ability section.
Yeah.
I mean, as someone who was a recurring scholar badge holder, when I didn't take up science and I took up humanities, it was a huge blow to some of my teachers that what's wrong with her, you know. And it was the best decision of my life to anyone listening. I mean, having said that, yeah, there was this system of, okay, if you get 80% and above every year, then if you get it for 3 years, then you get a blue coat, and then if you get 3 more years, then you get a blue tie, and then if you get it last 2 years, then you get a gold medal. I did get a gold medal, if I may say so, at the cost of sounding completely full of myself, but that was not the point. At some point, when I was in grade 11, they also introduced, finally, like these other colored blazers for sports and other achievements. But it took that long, you know, for other forms of excellence to be recognized, to be identified, to be rewarded. But by the time you're 17, 18, a lot of your development has already happened.
The way you like identify with yourself,
yes, and
your confidence.
I did not realize how much this script of achievement in academics influences the way you think about yourself and the way you also think you are thought of amongst your peers, until I then later went to college and until I was forced to reflect on my journey in therapy and, you know, as a therapist, etc., etc. But I think what has happened is the narrative in schools and amongst parents has changed. Even, I mean, today if we talk about it, yes, it has changed, or I would say it is changing at a surface level, but unconsciously we continue to be playing out the same sense of aspiration as Mrs. Adams talked about, you know, the same level of, but if I got 90% always, I do not know how to think about my child who is not capable, yes, or even saying that is not allowed, that means, no, he's not making an effort. You understand, he's not making an effort, he needs to do more, he needs to do more, he needs to do more, you know, and how much pressure that is creating on the child, it is unbelievable. And often schools are demonized, therapists are demonized, teachers are also demonized, but most importantly, the child becomes the bearer of all that pressure
from the parent.
And then that comes out in various ways,
Yeah.
because they don't have a language or vocabulary or sometimes even the permission to talk about it.
Now in fact, you speak about something very interesting about how the entire, the burden in a way gets thrown to in many different directions. And if we were to think about, in cases now, there is of course a lot more awareness where now we even know words like neurotypical and neurodivergent, and we understand it's a spectrum and so on and so forth. And of course, there are a lot of resources to figure out, okay, this is the diagnosis and these are the tools and resources, etc., etc. But what really happens when the diagnosis happens? Maybe you figured out these are the tools and resources that you need to figure out for your child. But maybe speak a little bit about that emotional journey of a parent. And what does that mean of how they react to some of these things for the child?
So, I sometimes wonder what is neurotypical. We are also not neurotypical. And that's the current conversation around it and a narrative around it, fortunately, that there is space for everyone. And that's what the word spectrum kind of, it creates space for everyone, All colors, there's space for all colors. I think as having worked, and actually I'll add a personal element to it. I grew up with a sibling who had hearing impairment, yes, and he was not born with it. So I firsthand witnessed a parental journey where you get thrown into something that you're not prepared for, right? And that's how subsequently my mother became known for her work in special needs, etc. And she formulated this, this social integration model in schools. And so a lot of my ideas around a lot of my understanding is actually what I heard her talk about.
Yeah.
Not just as a parent, but also as a professional. And what she said even 30 years ago applies even today, which is that there is an instant, of course, spike in anxiety. I would call it a spiral where
when you just get to...
Yes, when you just get to know there is a journey of defending against it and denial, until you really realize that there is a problem. So some time gets lost in that. But if there is quick acceptance, then you get, the special education part, you get but the agenda still remains. We're doing all of this to fix the problem, yes? And what that takes the parent away from is actually understanding the child, the problem, and also the fact that something has happened to them.
Yeah.
And yes, it is demanding, and while it should not have happened, it has. And the emotional toll it takes, because obviously, depending on the needs of the child, of course, learning difficulties like dyslexia, dyscalculia, of course, they are challenging, but every difference, every every special need comes with its own range of challenges, right?
Right.
And then the hyper focus in that emotional state, you end up hyper focusing on the challenges.
Yeah.
So you
fix it.
Yes. So you completely forget that, but there are also strengths. And there's a lot that you can do with those strengths in your child to be able to build on those challenges. You understand? And to build on the learning. And that learning is not limited to A, B, C, D and algebra. And I've never used algebra in my life. And then, of course, the desire becomes, the aspiration becomes that he has to do this school curriculum, and then this board, and then there's 10th boards, and there's 12th boards. So you keep forcing a child into the classroom, not realizing that that's what you need and want, but it's not what the child needs. You understand? And of course, every child comes with his or her own needs. There are social needs as well. There are so many dimensions to understanding children with needs. But I think what is often overlooked is the very, very different emotional journey that parents whose children get diagnosed with a challenge end up finding themselves on, because there is no one-size-fits-all path. There is a sense of exclusion and segregation that not only the children experience, but the parental unit and families also experience, because schools are either not, they don't have the infrastructure, or they're not willing to make the infrastructure to accommodate for those children. And I think that's wherein the problem lies. Because again, we are giving the one size fits all message. You know, and again, it's about academics, because there's so much more that you can do with children who have challenges and difficulties with support, OT, special ed, etc. So I think it's important to keep those parents in mind and bring them back into the mainstream, because it's their goddamn right, you know, as Mrs. Adams says. It's their goddamn right, you know. They're no different from a child who's performing 100 out of 100, you know.
Now, if you were to try to think about from a parent point of view, and I want to also cover the teacher point of view. So if there are 5 things, at least emotionally, that, you know, the top 5 things that a parent should really think about, you know, once something is flagged to them. Okay, first is, of course, I'm assuming is just coming out of denial. But what are the top 5 things emotionally that they need to, in fact, always remember?
So I would share what I look out for in terms of course, there are the basics of sudden changes, you know. Sometimes they can be gradual as well, but changes in physical milestones in terms of sleep, eating behaviors, energy levels, you know. If a child is suddenly feeling listless for no overt reason, it would be important to explore that with the child.
Right.
Inability to experience closeness and emotional intimacy with friends. So not being able to make friends and then not being able to sustain friends, to me is a very important indicator of what's going on with the child. So I mean, that's it. I'm not sitting and diagnosing. I don't work as a diagnostician. Number 3 would be inability to experience and tolerate frustration. Because frustration tolerance is a very, very important skill. The ability to be disappointed, I mean, to manage disappointment, whether it's in your interpersonal relational dynamics, whether it's from teachers, whether it's...
Because the kid is watching.
So I think frustration tolerance is very important. I'm thinking of 2 other.
So essentially, once, of course, to keep a lookout on, you know, just to list it, to keep a lookout on if there are any variations in just more like sleep, energy levels. Number 2 you mentioned is their emotional relationships with their friends and family. And then lastly is then for them to manage their own frustrations,
failures of any kind.
And fears.
The first one, what I was trying to talk about, sudden personality changes, which cannot be explained by anything else. I think overuse of technology, misuse of technology, both pretty much fall into the same, because what that implies is that they're just not spending enough time outside of it and connecting with friends. So that is definitely a current massive problem, because it is going to impact the way they relate in the world. You know, it's a massive disconnection, and then there's loneliness, and I recently heard of a very scary app from a teenager I work with called Ogle or something, where you can just enroll and register and speak to strangers. And it can be used
age
for
group?
Nothing. There is nothing. You can use it for
anonymously.
Anything. Yes, it's anonymous, and then you can share your address and you can share any and everything. My God, you know, it's. I actually Googled it in session and I was like, what is this? Because I don't know about it. So I think that, and I would say the incapacity to carry out age-appropriate tasks. You know, which is how do they take care of themselves at 4 versus 10 versus 14 needs to gradually keep changing. So if that is not changing, and if
they need to keep an eye out.
Is it because you are not allowing them? You know, is it that you are not fostering their independence and autonomy to an extent that they are able to, because then you are again arresting their development. So I think that would be the 5th.
And in this entire scenario, if maybe imagine a scenario where there's Prachi, she is basically gone through the entire diagnosis. Parents are probably in denial right now. So, what would you say to parents who probably have just sort of gotten the results of diagnosis? Of course, it's for them, from their point of view, it's scary because this is the world of unknown. They've not experienced it before. So, how do they manage their own emotional health?
So, very interesting you use the word diagnosis, because often the families I work with, I remind them I'm not a diagnostician.
Yeah.
I'm trained and qualified to understand diagnosis, but at least I explain myself and identify myself as a treatment specialist, because from what I have understood in my experience of working with children and adolescents, and theory as well, your brain is developing right up till 25. Yes, while of course a lot is already developed until, but for example, toddlerhood, adolescence are the critical periods where a lot of changes can happen. Neuroplasticity is on. Parenting itself is an intervention, and then if you get support of other kinds, for example, therapeutic support, that is not necessarily because your child has become a label. It is that, to understand it along a continuum, that he's somewhere along it, he's experiencing disturbance, disturbance of some kind, and if we address it, then he's likely to not go further along that. So I call it preventive work.
Yeah.
You understand? It's preventive work. It's not so much about, oh my God, he's got this. Because then that becomes, and how we speak about it to the child and how we equip the child with the knowledge of what he or she is going through is also very powerful, because often they become
What would be an example of that? Good and bad.
For example, you could be having symptoms of depression. Doesn't mean you are depression. I am clinically depressed is a particular way of saying it. But I was coming to the merits of diagnosis. Of course, it gives you a direction and an indication of work, and some families really feel relieved that it's not our fault. It's a medical problem. You understand? So it's not all that bad, but I am a bit cagey about using diagnostic labels to it's similar to the neurotypical conversation, right? We're all neurodivergent in some way.
We're all on the spectrum.
We're
somewhere.
all weird.
Yeah.
In our own ways. We all have our idiosyncrasies. So even with that, I think it's really about, my clinic is called Story Room.
Okay.
And the reason is that I have a philosophy that pretty much what we do in psychotherapy is helping the client and families. In this case, I work with families as well, or with parents when I'm working with children, to live out parts of their story which haven't fully been integrated and metabolized. They haven't fully been lived. And once you really live it and you understand it, once you experience it, you might know something bad happened to me, but to feel something, what that something was, is the work you do in therapy, right? And those are the skills you develop. And as you live it, a lot of changes are going to happen. I would like to believe a lot of transformation happens, and that's where healing happens.
Yeah.
And what that 18-year-old would then look back at age 15 and say, oh, this happened to me, but now I look at it like this. It could be very different from a 15-year-old who never gets the support. So to also bring in, yes, parents invariably struggle with allowing their children, even though the children might be asking them for therapeutic support, to actually seek it out. I mean, they kind of become the blocks that, no, you don't need it, talk to us. You have to understand they can't. You are their parents. You can only play that role. A therapist is not ever going to replace you. So it is not outsourcing your parenting. It is to support and create a better communication amongst the system, because a lot of times, a lot of mental health concerns come in when there is a breakdown in that communication. So,
have you ever seen the other side of it, where you felt that there is trying to overdiagnose and
everything? I mean, we are living in an Instagram world where everybody's got ADHD, everybody has got anxiety, everybody is on the spectrum, everybody is just diagnosing themselves. And again, I think it is, I think when change happens and when things are in flux, that often happens until a new equilibrium is established. But yes, I worry for children and adolescents the most who are reading this information and data on Instagram, where influencers and a lot of people are actually coming out in the best intentions to talk about, I suffered from this and hence I am like this and this is my journey. Of course, like, it's great that they're doing it, but information by itself is just information. You have to synthesize it for it to become knowledge. But nobody's talking, those children are not having conversations about what they're reading with anyone. Therapy becomes a space where they can have those conversations. Therapy becomes a space where they can even talk about, I saw this on Netflix. Because that's also consumption, right? They're spending a lot more time on Netflix today than they are with you. So it's meaningful what they take from it. And then how do you help them filter through what should be taken, what meaning they're making out of it, and how are they carrying it into their relationships and their relationship with life and the world.
Interesting.
So,
I mean, the other thing which, we've been thinking a little bit about is also how to use tech in schools, right? And the reason why, it sort of came to me is because a lot of what we do as kids or even adults actually, we don't create anything out of tech until unless it's used for work, but it's passive consumption. So when it's constant passive consumption, there are pop-ups, you click on it, then there is autoplay, right? So it keeps going on and on and on. And in that sense, once that happens and when you're not applying it, when you're not discussing it, I think that is where probably a lot of the problem emerges.
And then it's
hard
leaking
to
out
avoid
of them,
it fully.
Yeah, it's leaking out. That's overstimulation. So then it's leaking out in other ways, and it's leaking out in the form of them wanting to, of course, become influencers and saying, I mean, for example, a big area of development where it has massively swayed adolescents is gender and sexuality, which, of course, is a very important part of development, but the narrative is not what is actually internal, it is what has been internalized based on what is trendy.
What is trendy, actually.
So, and that's where the early access to Instagram and influencers and social media and blah, blah, yada, 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 it never ends.
Yeah, so, and we see that, I mean, right from a smaller age, right? Like whenever you go, even at the airport, and when I say this with utmost respect, I think managing a toddler, traveling with them and managing a lot of the stuff which goes around with travel is very hard, but you almost always see how there is always a screen in front of a kid. That might even be an 8-month-old kid or a 5-year-old or 10-year-old, and that is the way to pacify them.
Screens have replaced pacifiers.
Yeah, in fact, actually that's a good way to say, because they are actually, in fact,
except that screens are designed to induce addiction. It changes your neurowiring. I mentioned the book by Jonathan Haidt. It's called The Anxious Generation. It is changing the way brains are developing, and it is extremely scary because we actually don't know what the long-standing effects are going to be, right? We are only currently the children who experienced iPads and phones early on are at 14 or 15, I think. So what it's going to do to them in the long term, I don't know. I mean, we don't know. And the only thing we know is that there is an impact. Just the way they relate to the world, the way they think about themselves, the way they feel about themselves. I mean, think about it. My best friend recently went to, I think, Bali, and over there he would visit this coffee shop or something, right? And every time he would go, there was this child, possibly 2.5, and just had 5-6 photographers. It's like being papped. 5-6 photographers, and she's posing, and can you imagine?
Was it an influencer?
I mean, it was a 2.5-year-old child.
Okay.
So can you imagine the internal experience, the internal world of this child, what it means to be papped, and then what it means when all that attention is not there, it's withdrawn, because that's not reality.
And suddenly it drops.
And being treated like this VIP, so it's very scary. I mean, all said and done, I think technology, I know my friends make fun of me because I'm very technologically challenged, but it is scary how it's changing the world, but I guess every generation experiences a revolution of its own kind. And I mean,
An equilibrium sort of.
yeah, we went into
Comes in.
colored televisions and iPads and iPods and this and that, and now it is AI. So comes with its own dangers. But my only request to whoever the authorities are would be regulate.
Yeah.
Regulate. Don't only think about consumerism and the money you're making, because it's going to destroy lives.
So Nanki, you mentioned how we've started to see iPads and phones as pacifiers, like literal pacifiers. What do you think is now, what's the impact of something like that when these such, pacifying, devices become pacifiers, and what sort of emotional dysregulation signs have you started to see in kids?
I think the question really is, what are we what are these iPads pacifying them out of?
Yeah.
Because that's the purpose of a pacifier, right? When there is some internal restlessness, you put that pacifier in. I think devices are designed to induce a sense of numbing, that you're numbing something out, and so to tune into the device, you need to tune out of your internal world, right? And
like an escape.
Yes, and what we don't realize is that by constantly consuming a reel 1, reel 2, reel 3, and that's scrolling, doom scrolling it's called. I learned from a patient. It's called doom scrolling. And it is addictive. Like, you go on and on. I've experienced it. I do experience it. I'm guilty of it as well, because some of them are just fun, but the dopamine hit is just so immediate that, and then you just keep loving. You're in a loop and you don't know how to get out of it. So it completely tunes you out of your internal world and tunes you into this fake external world, which is easier to focus on, because in that internal world are all kinds of feelings, right? Good, bad, ugly. There's nothing known as bad feelings. It's difficult, unpleasant feelings. So what begins as a distraction ends up becoming a coping mechanism and ends up just becoming the way you are, and it has now become the normal way to be. Like everyone, for example, I recently heard of a bunch of teenagers sitting on a dinner table at a beach, but they were all on their phone. Can you imagine? That is so sad. So socially also, it is tuning them out of each other. So they know how to speak on
through a
devices, but they don't know how to speak to each other. It's awkward. They don't know what facial expressions mean. They don't know
how to read body language.
Yeah, they're a lot more in their head and in their devices, because they don't have enough data, experiential data, relational data of being with each other. So they know what closeness over a device feels like, but they actually don't know what closeness, in-person closeness feels like. Friendship has changed. So a lot of teenagers, for example, that I work with, report not wanting to go to school, because in any case, we can talk to everyone online, and I'm getting all my assignments done. So the need for school has devolved. And that is alien to someone like me who loved going to school.
Yeah.
I would get FOMO when I didn't go, when I was absent.
But you would miss out, right?
Yes.
Because you would meet your friends
Yes.
and tell you something, and then otherwise you would miss out on that. But now, because you have your device, you're not really missing out on anything.
So, and there's nothing, everybody is competing with that device, and nothing is going to match up, because we're just not the same.
Developmentally, I don't know if that's the right word, does this tech thing also play a part there?
In terms of psychological development?
Or just body, psychologically, mentally.
Like I said, when it comes to the body, if they rather be on iPads than playing in the playground, childhood obesity.
Yeah.
Not knowing basic, your sensory integration happens through play, through parks, through each other. We used to play pittu, learning rules, social rules of games. It's your den, it's my den. All of that was fun. None of that exists anymore.
Yeah.
Also problem solving, treasure hunt. That I'm in your team,
and just the excitement around it.
Yes. So
and that was to be the dopamine hit. Probably.
Exactly. The shades of joy, the texture of joy has flipped,
and you have to work for it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's really sad. The texture of joy having become this is, again, me and my best friends often we we are just soothing each other with the reels of, this is what 90s kids were like. This is what classroom was like then. Like for us, joy was ganging up against our middle school and senior school teachers, But they don't know how to do that anymore, because you need a certain level of connectedness amongst the classmates, amongst friends, to be able to bully a teacher, which is a rite of passage in high school, not to bully teachers, but that doesn't happen anymore. So it's the takeover of
and
technology.
the other piece also, I think I see that in myself, and I'm sure it must be even at a higher level, especially when you're growing up, is the impact of tech on sleep and focus.
Absolutely.
Just functionally, quality of sleep deteriorates a lot more if you have absolutely no buffer before bed.
It's that blue light, right?
Yeah.
And it has taken some learning and therapy for myself, and teaching myself to put away the phone and not be the first thing to pick up in the morning, because my own quality of sleep got disturbed. And the kids are not wrong when they're telling me that, but what do I do? My assignments are also on iPads. And I think that is the dilemma currently, where you can't isolate them from technology. Then you're not
because that is not the world
they're growing up in. So then are you doing them a disservice by not giving them technological skills? But I don't know. I think it's time will tell. The only thing you can again bring in is regulation, and monitoring, and that's where parents' roles come in. That they do not have the brain development to regulate and make those boundaries themselves, and that's where their presence, physical and emotional, matters. Where they help them make the boundaries, follow through with those boundaries, and let them know that if your boundaries are not being followed, then there are consequences. That's how they will understand. And that's across age groups.
And some of these things, of course, we talk a little bit about the environment, right? Which is the social media everywhere. Sabhi cheezon ke liye ab chat GPT hai, so you quickly also get the answer, so you don't really have to work on you
don't have to work for anything.
For a dopamine hit, you don't have to work, because you get through that scroll, you get that
for
answer.
everything there's an app. You want to send something, now courier is via Porter, you can just get it from your friends. You want to
whatever you want to eat, you'll get it in 10 minutes.
Zomato, Swiggy, Blinkit, of course the companies are making loads of money, but we are not realizing the psychological cost to us. Of course it's convenient, but there's a reason why some people in the outskirts are actually leading far more peaceful lives, than those in the cities where these services exist.
I want to speak a little bit about these kids who are growing up in this so-called fast-paced environment. Maybe, there are a lot of expectations very quietly from parents, because there's a certain institution and a place that mom and dad work at, and so there's a quiet sense of pressure which builds in. What has been your observation in kids like these? Are they able to manage that sort of pressure, or is there at all any sort of quiet pressure in these high performance families?
I think what I want to say is the pressure is not very quiet. It's very loud. And I think what we often forget is that communication in families is not just verbal, it's also non-verbal. The environment gets internalized. How we speak about each other, how we speak about our children, how we speak about our childhoods, our experiences, our achievements, becomes their script in how they should be leading their lives. So
and what would be an example of how?
For example, I went to such and such school, and I always got 95%. And then, I really struggled, but I went to IIT and I went to IIM, and then I became the CEO and the founder of such and such company. And all of that is well and good. And then the dictate to the child is, but see, I did all of this, and I've created all of this to give you a good education, so you've got it better because my life was harder.
And hence you must do.
And hence you must use all of this to go from, I came from 0 to 5, you must take it to a 10. So what that does is it has already hijacked that child's life by making decisions for him which he may not want to make, he may not be capable of making.
Or it's just not ready yet.
And he may, I mean, you're deciding his life. You know, it's a bit bizarre to take over any individual's life like that. You wouldn't have liked it if your parents did it, right? So, and then a lot of times, no, but our parents just gave us education and that's what we're doing. But the world is a very different place, and education itself is very different today. We are not living in a world where degrees mean as much as what skill development means, for example, So we need to contextualize all of that and to really understand where children are at. However, having said that, I think the other side of it is that often high achieving parents also forget that because they've achieved so much, whatever their stories. So I think the real theme to think about over here is how do they bring their own personal stories into their parenting, because then it is, I never got all of this, so I have to give my child everything. Right? And a lot of times that everything looks material. Yes, but it comes at the cost of emotional. And I'll give you a simple example of, I once was at a workshop, parenting workshop, and I was talking about this and how play is just absent and what are parents doing and what's really happening. And I got a very interesting question that you don't understand. I worked, I'm a millennial and I worked so hard to buy myself it was a fancy car. I won't name the car. And what about my wishes and desires? And I want to drop my child in that car. So how are you saying to shield him from, the brands and that's actually not what I had said, but that was his takeaway. What about my wishes? What about my desires? I also want to boast to my child. And the only thing I could say to him was that, of course, I'm nobody to tell you not to buy that car and not to tell your child what is valuable. But when your child becomes 20 and above, he's not going to remember which car you drove him to school in. He's only going to remember the conversations you had with him on the way and how you made him feel in that. So in fact, even if you walk him to school, he's going to remember that. He's not going to remember the brand of the car that he went in. And if he does, then we're getting something very wrong. So I think that's what I would conclude that with.
Yeah. In this entire scenario, is it at all possible for a school to try and, help in this, situation? Because, there is so much of what you see at home, and then you basically come and bring that here to school, where the school ideally wants you all as students to be at the same level and sort of engage in learning, community, and so on. But is there at all a place where a school could help?
So I think that's a very layered question, in the sense that if you really notice, schools also cater to a particular type of class of family, right? And then that becomes the prototype and the stereotype. So as Mrs. Adams put a term to it in my episode, people like us. So, and then you only want to acquaint with people like us. And that's one kudos I give to my not so great school, DPS Argument, because there were so many people over there and it's often demonized for that. But the fact is, there were so many people that you just learned to be with every kind. And at that time, it didn't matter who was rich, who was poor, how they came to school, whether they came in a car, whether what was their bank balance. That's one thing that school gets right. I really want to say that.
Yeah.
But I notice, especially as someone who belongs to Delhi and has lived there all my life, that's not the case with most other schools, most other well-known schools, because people take pride in being cliquey, in being, we went to this school, which means we belong to this kind of a residence and this kind of you understand?
Yeah.
So then how do schools help? You can't, because schools also have to sustain themselves. Schools also have to let their identity evolve based on the client.
And it also in some ways becomes important for their own quote-unquote brand.
Yes. So
it's, some of this is in so much conflict.
Yes.
That it's just such a
and
hard
that's why there is
and
that's why there's always place for a new school.
Yeah. Well.
And then to at least try and change the script, try to flip the script, try to figure out something new. But invariably I've seen that it does end up getting, obviously with time, it has its own developmental journey, no? So with time, it will formulate its own identity, personality. These are the kind of parents who want to send their children to this kind of a school, and I've seen that play out across years, and I don't think that can change. Or I don't see it changing. I don't know. I'm not an authority on schools, but I'm basing it on my own experience of having grown up in a city like Delhi, where there are those same kind of schools, and everyone wants admission in the same school.
Only those schools, yeah.
And aspiration again comes in, and then you want your child to also acquaint with the specific kind of a peer and a specific kind of a friend.
And honestly, that also becomes a way to select schools for many parents.
That is the gatekeeping.
Where would I want my child to hang out, and where also I would like to sort of hang out.
Where would I also feel like I can form my own sense of community with other parents, because you are then going to spend the next 14 years there, if you are in a permanent place in your life. And I don't think it's entirely, it should not be demonized. I mean, I'm not saying it as something which is a fault, because, I mean, I don't think I have a resolution to it. I think what I'm trying to say is it's natural, right? And you want your...
I mean, also practically speaking, what happens is, if you were to just think of school as a product for a minute, right? This product can only have so-and-so features and qualities if it is priced at a certain level.
Yes.
And hence, by that definition, you end up excluding people who cannot pay that price.
Exactly.
And because that quality and price, in some senses, or the features around it, right? Like, okay, there is a badminton court and this and that. And so that is why this is a little bit in sort of conflict. But one of the things which probably could try and solve for it is if schools try to have the intention of having the culture, this culture of, raising children with, say, being grounded. Resilience.
Not just in theory.
And having that filter when they interview parents. Instead of having the filter of which school or which college did you go to, or where do you live.
Resilient parents will raise resilient children. But I think, since you said that the culture, but where does it start from? So it's the vision of the school. But I think a lot of it
the parents who end up,
I think a lot of it comes down to the leadership. What is important to those who are sitting in the leadership, because at the end of the day, they enjoy the power. For decision making.
Right.
And the lives of those families, children, parents are in the hands of the leadership. So how does the principal talk about mental health, for example? How does the vice principal
about inclusion,
physical education? How do we treat our physical education teachers? A lot of times they're not treated with the same respect that
same with the math teacher.
Yes. I mean, there is a gender disparity also in school. Of course, it's a female-dominated profession. We need more men in professions like both teaching and therapy.
I mean, honestly, what you bring up is a very important point, and there is actually there is a two-part problem to, behind it. Essentially, is that teaching as a profession, unfortunately, is paid very underpaid. Little.
Grossly underpaid, grossly undervalued.
And because we are also in a society where we expect the man to be the primary breadwinner.
Yes.
And hence, we don't see as many men in jobs which would probably inherently pay low. मतलब किसी भी school में चले जाओ, मतलब थोड़ा बहुत difference होगा, but not a lot. And that is how we sort of end up with two problems in the recipe, and then this is the product. So,
I think there's also a huge change in teachers who became teachers versus teachers who are becoming teachers today. Because until a certain century ago, I don't know how many years ago, but there was an era where teachers became teachers because they had time and they've already given birth and their husbands are working and they had nothing to do, So joining a school was the noble thing to do and it was an easy thing to do.
It helped with, managing home.
And it just helped and it gave them something to do. Again, I'm not at all saying that that's bad. It created a great generation of people. But I think today there is a huge change with, so there is that era of teaching and teachers, obviously then the attitude with which they approach students was very different from the way a teacher who wants to become a teacher, who ends up actually pursuing a course of education to become better at teaching and pedagogy, and where we're seeing a lot of those new teachers emerge, the younger lot. And it's important to, again, this is not an age conversation,
Yeah.
but there is a change, and it is changing the quality of the teacher-child experience.
Yeah. No, but this is a great conversation. Thank you so much, Nanki. And what I've learned essentially is that parenting, like you actually mentioned this, the first thing in our conversation, and that it takes a village to raise a child. And I think now this village includes not just parents, but their extended family, the community that they probably live in, and the schools as well. So, but thank you so much for such a rich conversation, and thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
This summer, we are bringing to you the Anandi Makers Base Camp. In the Anandi Makers Base Camp, children end up solving a real-world problem by building some cool gadgets, managing finances, pitching to investors, and then selling to real customers. Along the way, they'll pick up creativity, curiosity, and some real-world business skills. This isn't actually just a summer camp. It's the launchpad for the next generation of builders, innovators, and creators. So join us.